Welcome to State of Wellbeing, a podcast from South Dakota State University. The State of Wellbeing is a holistic well-being podcast with the goal of supporting the campus community as we strive to be a growing, high-performing, and healthy university.
Welcome to another episode of the State of Wellbeing podcast. My name is Teresa Seefeldt. I serve as the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at South Dakota State University, and I'll be hosting this episode highlighting one of our resources available to assist faculty and staff in helping our students in distress. And I am joined today by Toby Uecker, our Dean of Students. Toby, would you like to just tell a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to. Like you said, I'm Toby Uecker, Dean of Students here at SDSU since 2020. So have a little bit of time working with some of these resources and enjoy the work that I do as our student ombudsperson. So that means working when maybe students have some issues that go across one small area and sort of factor into a bunch of different things. And then that also means being a good resource for our faculty and staff colleagues as they want to be parts of students' solutions. I also supervise our American Indian Student Center, our Veterans Affairs Resource Center, and our student conduct teams. So we have directors in each of those areas, but I get to work with all three of those areas. And so that's keeping me plenty busy in the Dean of Students role.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, a little bit of background for today's topic. When we first started the State of Wellbeing podcast a year ago, one of our goals was really to bring awareness to resources that are available to faculty, staff, and students to help with their own well-being, but also to assist others in the Jackrabbit community with their well-being. And this topic really fits directly into that goal, thinking about one of the major resources that is available for faculty and staff in assisting students with their well-being. And it is called the Red Folder. So Toby, would you just start by telling us a little bit about what the Red Folder is and maybe how it fits into that broader picture of mental health and well-being resources that we have here at SDSU?
Sure. So Red Folder predates my time as Dean of Students. I think it was something that came out right before I came into this role in 2020, and so actually right before sort of the pandemic and all of the different needs and things that were coming with that time frame as well. And Red Folder is a site on the public website for SDSU. All you have to do is type in Red Folder in the search bar, and it takes you right there. It was named that way, I think, very specifically for that reason. We don't do a lot of things in red here at SDSU, but Red Folder sticks out as a real memorable thing for our faculty and staff to know as a resource. And the basic idea, modeled off some other places that we had looked at with similar resources, is that Red Folder provides a little bit of a in the moment, how might I think about helping the student sort of scenario. And so it's a good thing that serves sort of a dual purpose of being a place that faculty and staff could go right now to familiarize themselves with resources, but also something that they could pull up on a computer on their desktop in a moment as they're navigating something with students, to be connected to those resources and to think a little about how they might respond to a student that's presenting in crisis.
Yeah, so if a faculty member or staff member accesses the Red Folder off the public website, what type of information are they going to find there?
So the thing that sort of is the framework that makes up Red Folder is sort of a guide for how to recognize, respond, refer, and provide resources for students. And so that's what's going to pop up on the very top of that page, are nice little icons that help you think about those things. So recognize has a little magnifying glass icon. That's about what might you see that might give you a reason to be concerned about a student. And so lists some of the behaviors or some of the sort of observations a person might have that say, oh, I'm a little bit worried about this person. And so starts to help identifying some of those things. Respond provides some sort of ways to have that initial conversation with a student who's maybe responding in crisis. So it's got the little sort of character bubbles from a comic as its icon to think about conversation, how to have a first interaction with a student and say, hey, I'm a little bit concerned. Could I be helpful to you? The refer icon is a person with lots of different checkboxes next to them. And so that gives the idea of who might be an immediate next person on campus that someone could connect a student to. And so that's going to have a lot of those resources and is a little distinct from that resources section, which might be a little bit broader in terms of providing lists of how the student might find a useful piece of information or a useful connection or a long-term office that might serve them well. That resource page is a little bit broader, and maybe for those things that are longer lasting than just a next step, but might be a long-term assistance to a student.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the 4 R's of the model. It's an easy way of remembering really how to help a student that is in distress. But I'm curious if you have some tips for helping faculty and staff really be able to practically use this information. You know, if you have a student in your office right in front of you that is expressing some concerning behaviors or language, how can a faculty or staff member really use this tool to be able to assist that student?
Sure. So I think that one of the things I would suggest is, because it's so quick to be able to pull up, I would say it's something that as soon as you start to feel that maybe like, oh, I don't know quite what's going on here, you can just sort of, in the process of normal sort of movement within that conversation, can make sure it's kind of pulling up and just is a resource that's easy to get to on the screen right while you're there. I think for me, as someone who's a responder and a helper, it's sometimes nice just to have the vision of, okay, I know I have some things literally at my fingertips that if this goes in a direction that's more than I'm completely prepared for with my own experience, I can go right to the screen and say, you know, I actually have some resources pulled up if you'll let me take a second to look at that and help you out. So I think that's a tip that I would offer. I also think within using the tool, being ready to narrate to that student kind of what you're going through as you interact with them, right? So I think it can be an assumption, or it can be something that we're afraid of, that if we sort of say out loud what we're experiencing, that might have some negative impact on the interaction with the student. But I've actually found that if you're interacting with a student, you have some concern, I think first of all, it can be very successful to say things like, you know, I'm observing this about our interaction, and that's something that's making me a little concerned for you. And so to be able to put a specific on what you might see or experience with that student that's causing you concern can actually be really helpful in building a bond with that student to say, oh yeah, I am sort of exhibiting that. I can see how that would be interpreted that way. I think it's also true about using the red folder, right? If you've got it up on your screen, I think we're so well trained to be really in the moment with that student, looking at them in the eye, making sure they're our focus, that we might really hesitate to pull focus away from the conversation. But I think that if you can narrate why you're doing that to the student, it again helps build rapport rather than cutting off that rapport. So if you're talking to a student, you know, they're sharing maybe some information that you're really concerned about, you don't know quite what the right resource is, and you say, you know, I'm going to ask you to stop for just a second. I appreciate that you're sharing this really important stuff with me. I want to be able to provide you with a really good resource or connection point. And to do that, I'm going to take a look at this resource I have on my computer that can really show the care you have for the student while also giving you that opportunity to connect to the resource.
I really like that tip. I think from the student perspective, if you don't know why the faculty member or staff member is turning away and looking at that computer, it could be easy to perceive that incorrectly. So narrating that's a fantastic tip. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. One other thing that I think I would add that I think is sometimes hard in the moment is, along with narrating, being very direct. And so I think I think that connects to the narration of here's what I see and here's why I'm concerned. But I think it's also about readying yourself for very direct interactions to say, it sounds like you really could use or are seeking my help. Is there a way that you know of I can be helpful to you? Or to ask specifically if a student is considering harming themselves. I think that's sometimes something that can feel really hard or really scary, but a lot of crisis intervention training helps us to know that being that direct with a question can be very helpful in that interaction. And so I think it's important to remember that not every student that comes into your office that you think, oh, this might be a situation to use the red folder, not every student that you're interacting with will be in a place where they're in danger of harming themselves, but being okay with very simply and very directly asking that question is something I think every helper, whether it's in a setting like a college environment or whether it's out in the rest of the world we live in, the more comfort we can have with that directness, the better we will be able to truly serve the students and the people we're trying to help.
So I'd like to delve into that a little bit more then, because these are, uncomfortable conversations for many people to have. And so first of all, when we're looking at that first R, that recognize, what should a faculty or staff member be looking for to recognize some of these patterns of behavior in a student to know that those are follow-up questions that they should be asking?
Sure. So I think what I often encourage is really about knowing the interaction with your student as well as you can to observe something that's out of the norm, right? So I think recognizing when a student maybe comes into your office or comes in to work with you and is off from what you expect. That can sometimes be the first kind of indicator that there's maybe more of a crisis present for that student. And so I think what I would offer is that it's probably very hard to identify a pattern of behaviors that uniformly indicate crisis, because it's going to present really differently with each individual student. What I think is possible to connect to crisis, if you observe it, is that pattern of behavior that feels different from the normal pattern of behavior with that student. So a student who your interaction has been consistently sort of upbeat and talkative and engaged with you, who comes in and is very subdued or very unengaged, that might be something to identify and say, hey, it feels like you're a little distant today. Is something going on? How can I help? Or sometimes we forget about the flip side. That student that typically is very sort of low emotive, just kind of comes in, does their job, moves on, does their thing, who comes in and very suddenly is almost hyperactive, might be a way that we think about or describe it. That, by being different from the normal interaction, might also be something that would make you say, hey, something feels a little different today. I wonder if there's something going on.
Yeah, that's great. Now, there is specific training that faculty and staff can participate in to help think about questions to ask a student, and specifically some of those more direct questions that you were talking about, such as if a student has thoughts of harming themselves or others. Now, we don't have time to go into all of the details that might be covered in that type of training. And in fact, I would encourage all of our listeners to look into options for, say, QPR training, for example. We offer that here at SDSU on a regular basis. But do you have any tips that you'd like to share with faculty or staff on being able to ask those types of direct questions to a student who might be in distress?
Sure. I think sometimes if it feels hard to jump right into that direct question, I think some of the really generalized, how are things going? How has your day been? Can be a starting point toward feeling more comfortable getting that direct. So I think, especially if it's a student that you have some rapport with, I think those initial narrating questions can help you either get some of the information that might help you go to that more direct question, or might help take the conversation in a different direction if that's what's more appropriate. And then I do think that narrative approach can sometimes be a part of the question, right? And so if you are sitting in a scenario and maybe that conversation has reached that sort of awkward silence, right? You're having the conversation with the student. You're sort of nervous about what to say next. You maybe want to ask that question but don't know how. I think sometimes verbally acknowledging, I feel really uncomfortable in this scenario, and this question is really hard for me to ask, but it's really important to me to get at the heart of this. And so I'm just going to jump out and say it. I'm wondering if you're considering hurting yourself. That could be a pathway that gets you there if the initial question feels really hard to you. And so I think, again, you heard that little narrative of identifying how I'm feeling in this scenario, but then using that to enter the question where I'm asking the student whether they're okay.
I really like that approach. I think it helps put the faculty member more at ease, but it could also actually help with the student as well if they see, okay, that faculty member or staff member is also expressing what they're feeling in that moment. Again, helping to build that connection between the student and the faculty or staff member.
Yeah, I think any way that we can help remind students that we as faculty and staff are people, just as we are faculty and staff, I think that's a good reminder in tons of settings. And I think for exactly the reason you point out, even in a challenging conversation setting, I think that can be an important step.
Yeah. Now, are there other resources that could help a faculty or staff member determine what the appropriate response might be? And specifically, I'm interested in how you as the Dean of Students help to assist faculty and staff in making some of these determinations about what the appropriate response might be.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think there is always a pretty wide range of potential response, right? So within both the resources on the red folder, but I think also in general how we approach crisis, answering that first question of, is there an immediate danger here, is sort of the first step of the process. And if that answer is yes, we're pretty well prescribed that if there's an immediate danger, a call to emergency services to UPD is the path that we go down, and we figure out the rest of the path later. But if the answer to that question is no, or I don't know whether there's an immediate crisis, then there's a lot more question marks. And so I think my role as Dean of Students, and something that I do pretty regularly, is respond to phone calls or emails from faculty members that say, hey, here's a interaction I had with a student. It was pretty clear they're not in immediate risk, but it's also pretty clear that everything's not fully okay either. And so I might respond back with, a resource or a way to connect them to our student counseling services, or to a academic or financial resource that can sometimes be part of what's really challenging for a student, or might say, maybe I can be a part of a conversation with the student and that faculty member that, again, connects them to a different resource on campus, or to someone that can put different pieces together that maybe the faculty member doesn't have all the information on. And so I think that's a role that I regularly play, and that I actually think is a really important part of the job that I have, is to be that liaison and be a good resource for our faculty and staff across campus.
Great. So let's say that the faculty member, does refer the student, say, to counseling services, or maybe it is more of that emergency situation and there is involvement of UPD. Is there any type of follow-up with the faculty or staff member after they report a concern about a student?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. So I think any time that a referral involves sort of a professional like a counselor or involves a medical response or an emergency response, it's tough for that follow-up to happen in a really formal way, because at that point, the student really becomes the kind of client of that other provider, and they have ethical sort of parameters that mean they can't always reach back out to the initial reporter and say, here's what we did, everything's great, thank you so much for making that referral, or can say, oh, it was a really challenging situation. That's just not information they can share. What happens typically when I get information from a faculty member is that I will respond to that person to say that initial thank you so much, to assure them that now that it's in sort of my awareness, we'll use all of the resources we have available to us through SDSU to follow up in the ways that we know to be helpful and useful. I might mention examples of some of those follow-ups, but probably won't say here's directly who we referred them to. But then we'll also encourage that faculty member or staff member to reach out to me if they have any other interactions or information that they think could inform the situation, or encourage them to be back in touch with that student themselves. Because A, that can, I think, continue to confirm for the student the presence of care from that faculty or staff member, but B, directly from the student themselves is probably the best way for them to learn about any appropriate outcome or things that they might need to know to continue being supportive of that student. And so I think that kind of response of, thank you, we'll use all the resources we have, and remember to be back in contact with me and with that student is kind of a standard response from my office.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful information for faculty and staff to know that a lot of these details in the follow-up may not be able to be shared for a variety of reasons. And so recognizing that as part of kind of closing that loop, if you will, on that intervention, I think is important to recognize. And I think the comments that you made about how you do encourage sometimes the faculty member to do some of that follow-up is really important as well. So we've talked about a lot of things related to the Red Folder and some of the other resources on campus available for faculty and staff in assisting students. But is there any other guidance or training available to ensure that faculty and staff really are prepared to assist students in these types of situations?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned already the QPR, the question, persuade, refer sort of model that we do some trainings on campus. And so I know that those are available through different resources. And so I think if you looked up for that, you would find available classes and sessions on a sort of an ongoing basis. I also think there are opportunities to just use other good sort of resources through our counseling services. So if, for example, a department wanted to have just a good conversation about what are strategies for being good supporters of having open, honest questions about mental health, I think that's something you could sure reach out to staff in counseling and see if they have a capacity for someone to come over and facilitate that kind of conversation. That strikes me as something that would be right up their alley. I also think we've had regular availability of mental health first aid training on campus. And so, again, I think that training has some really good strategies for exactly what to observe and maybe how to name some of the things that you observe. And so I think that's another one that's out there that is a resource we've seen be very empowering for faculty and staff, especially when they maybe don't have a big background in counseling or crisis management.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we've really done a nice overview of the Red Folder and the different questions and things and really practical tips for faculty and staff in their interaction with students. Is there anything else about the Red Folder or any of the other resources that you mentioned that you would like to tell our listeners about?
No, I think I'd maybe sort of go back to a comment I made earlier that I think Red Folder functions at its best in a dual role. And so I think sometimes we hear about that type of resource and put it in the back of our head and say, okay, I know to find that when I need it. But it's also a resource that if you went out there right now and just kind of skimmed through, maybe you'd find something that would sort of register for you in that moment in the future. Or maybe you'd find something you'd want to ask me a question about that would help you be that much more prepared. And so I guess I would encourage folks to take a look at the page and the site and have some familiarity with it so that the first time you're looking at it isn't just when you're maybe trying to respond to something. I think another piece that I would add, maybe not a separate resource, but something that I think is a good visual reminder, we do keep in our Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, so up in Morrill Hall 312, some stickers and sort of keyboard stickers and other things that have some of the most basic pieces of that 4R structure that you can put up as just a reminder in your office or on a notepad or a computer screen. And so that might be a resource that folks would be really interested in as well if they just want to kind of live in that mindset of how to think through having a tough conversation. That might be something that's just a good little prompt and matches all of our nice visual identity for campus. So they could sure come by and pick one of those up or come ask a question and see me in my office.
That's great. Well, thank you, Toby, for appearing on the episode today and sharing some information about this really important resource.
Absolutely. It's something that was a really great effort by folks that go before me, but I am glad to be able to use it and share it with others and have it be a starting point for conversations that I think are really important on our campus.
Fantastic. And thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of State of Wellbeing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of State of Wellbeing, a podcast from South Dakota State University. This podcast is brought to you by the Mental Wellbeing Team and SD State Health.